Before this story begins, it helps to understand the world that made it possible. A world where maps were not complete, not even close. In fact, most maps looked a bit like someone started drawing them, got distracted, and just decided, yeah, this is enough. Huge blank spaces sat in the middle of continents. Edges of the world were marked with words like unknown, here be monsters, or sometimes just nothing at all. And honestly, that silence on the map bothered people. A lot. Because humans don't really like empty spaces. Especially not on paper. So began what historians later called the Age of Distant Horizons. A time when people looked at the edge of the known world and thought, yeah, I should probably go there. Now, this wasn't just curiosity. It was something deeper. It was ambition. It was pride. And sometimes it was boredom. Because if you were living in a port city back then, you probably heard the same stories over and over again. Ships coming back. Ships leaving again. Merchants arguing about spice prices like their lives depended on it. Which, to be fair, sometimes they did. And in the middle of all that noise, there were always a few people staring at maps. Not just looking at them. Studying them. Tracing fingers across coastlines. Following rivers that led into nothing. Staring at white spaces like they were personal challenges. One of them might have said, if no one has been there, then why not us? And that's where it usually started. Now, governments and wealthy sponsors loved this kind of thinking. Because exploration meant trade routes. Trade routes meant money. And money, well, money is pretty convincing. So expeditions were funded. Ships were built. Crews were gathered. Scientists were invited along to sound important. And priests sometimes came too, just in case things went spiritually sideways. Everything looked organized on paper. But in reality, it was often just a group of people standing on a dock thinking, we're really doing this, huh? Now, the Age of Distant Horizons wasn't one single era. It stretched across generations. Slowly building. One voyage after another. Each expedition pushed a little further. A new island discovered. A new coastline drawn. A new storm survived or not survived. And every success made the next journey feel just a little more possible. Like the world was shrinking. Or like humans were slowly winning a very long argument with geography. But here's the funny part. The more they explored, the more dangerous things became. Because the easy routes were already known. The calm waters were already mapped. So what was left? Storm zones. Frozen seas. Strange currents. Places where compasses behaved like they had given up on life. But of course, that didn't stop anyone. If anything, it made the stories more exciting. Beyond this point, no one has returned. That line alone was enough to make some people pack their bags immediately. Which, honestly, is a questionable personality trait, but it was common. And so ships kept going. Wooden vessels creaking under the weight of supplies, instruments, and human hope. Sailors who laughed too loudly at the start of voyages, slowly learning the sound of silence at sea. Because the sea does something strange to people. At first, it feels like freedom. Open space. Endless horizon. Sunrise on water looks beautiful, very poetic, very Instagram-worthy, if you will forgive the comparison. But after weeks, maybe months, the horizon stops feeling beautiful. It starts feeling like a wall that never gets closer. Now during this time, navigation was still part science, part guessing, and part, let's hope that star is the right one. Maps improved slowly, but not enough to remove risk. And storms, well, storms didn't care how confident your captain looked. Still, explorers pushed forward. Because there was always the idea that just beyond the next stretch of ocean, something important waited. A passage. A new land. A shortcut to wealth. Or at least a good story for dinner conversations back home. And that hope was powerful. Maybe too powerful. Because it made people underestimate how large the world still was. And how small they were inside it. On land, empires were growing. Cities were expanding. Trade was booming. People were building universities, debating philosophy, arguing about maps in rooms that smelled like ink and ambition. But out at sea, things were different. Out there, everything depended on wind, luck, and whether your ship decided to stay in one piece that day. And yet, despite all that uncertainty, there was a kind of romance around exploration. Songs were written about it. Books were published. Children grew up hearing tales of brave sailors who sailed beyond the edge of the known world. No one really talked about the exhaustion, or the fear, or the long nights where nothing happened except the sound of water hitting wood over and over and over again. Because that part isn't very exciting, but it is real. And this is important for our story, because the expedition we're about to follow didn't begin in chaos. It began in that same hopeful spirit. That belief that the world still had secrets waiting to be found. That belief that a line on a map could be crossed, and something new would appear on the other side. Now, people today like to imagine explorers as fearless figures, standing at the bow of ships, staring into storms like they're optional. But in reality, most of them were just human. They got tired, they got cold, they got homesick. Some of them probably just wanted to eat warm food and sleep in a bed that didn't move. But they kept going anyway, because turning back wasn't always simple. There were sponsors waiting for results. There were reputations on the line. There were journals being written in real time, which is a surprisingly strong motivator not to fail publicly. And so expeditions became a mix of science, ambition, pressure, and quiet anxiety. A strange combination, but one that drove people farther than they probably should have gone. As the age of distant horizons continued, maps slowly filled in. Blank spaces shrank. Coastlines became familiar. Routes became standard. And slowly, exploration shifted from mystery to routine. But there were still places left. Far places. Cold places. Dangerous places. Places where even the best maps were still guesses. And that is where our story truly begins to take shape. Because not all expeditions returned. Some disappeared suddenly. Some failed dramatically. Some didn't vanish in an instant. They faded. Slowly. Quietly. Like ink drying out on an old map. And by the time anyone realized they were gone, it was already too late to remember the details properly. In the next chapter, we'll meet the man who believed he could push just a little further than everyone else. A man who looked at the unknown and didn't see danger first, but opportunity. And maybe that's where everything started to go wrong. Every expedition has a beginning, but more often than not, it also has a person who decides, yeah, I'll be the one to make this happen. In our story, that person was the expedition leader. We'll just call him the captain for now. Not because he was mysterious, but because history has a habit of forgetting names more easily than weather forgets storms. Now, the captain wasn't a young dreamer. He had already lived enough life to know that the world doesn't really care about your plans. He had been on voyages before. Some successful, some less worth mentioning at dinner parties. But overall, he had a solid reputation. The kind of reputation that makes people nod respectfully and then quietly hope they don't get assigned to your ship during a storm season. He was intelligent, careful, the kind of man who double-checked maps even after everyone else said, yeah, that looks fine. Which, honestly, is both a good trait and a slightly worrying one if you're about to cross half the world. Now, people often imagine expedition leaders as loud, dramatic figures. But the captain was not like that. He didn't shout much. He didn't need to. He had the quiet confidence of someone who had already seen enough bad decisions made by other people to stop making them loudly himself. But inside him, there was something else, kind of restlessness. Because success has a strange effect on people. It doesn't always make them satisfied. Sometimes it just raises the bar and whispers, "Alright, what's next?" The captain had already achieved recognition. He had been part of earlier voyages that filled in parts of the map. He had written reports. He had spoken in halls full of scholars who nodded like they understood more than they actually did. And yet, there was still one thing he hadn't done. One final journey that could define everything. The kind of journey people talk about long after you're gone. And that idea sticks to a person like salt on old ship ropes. Hard to remove. Hard to ignore. Now, back on land, he lived a quiet life between expeditions. Meetings. Occasionally staring out of windows in a way that made people assume he was thinking deeply. In reality, he might have just been wondering if he left something on the stove. We'll never know. But eventually, invitations started arriving. Not personal ones at first. More like requests from institutions. Groups of scholars. Trade sponsors. Governments with long-term interests and very short patience. They all wanted the same thing. Go further. Find what's beyond the last known regions. Confirm the rumors. Map the unknown. And if possible, bring something useful back. Something valuable would be nice. The captain read these requests carefully. Then reread them. Then probably stared at a map for a long time while drinking something warm and thinking too much. Because he knew what they were really asking. They weren't just asking for exploration. They were asking for risk. And risk always comes with a price. But here's the thing about people like him. They don't say no easily. Not because they are reckless, but because they start to believe they're the only ones who can do it properly. And that belief is very dangerous. Eventually, he agreed. Officially, the expedition would be funded, ships would be built, supplies gathered, and history would quietly begin shifting towards something uncertain. Now, selecting the crew was a task on its own. You don't just pick people for an expedition like picking groceries. Well, unless you're very confident in your grocery choices. But even then, this was different. He needed sailors, engineers, navigators, scientists, people who could survive isolation, cold, storms, and each other. Because, surprisingly, that last one is often the hardest. Some crew members were veterans. They had been on voyages before. They knew how to read winds, fix sails, and argue professionally. Others were younger, too curious, too eager. The kind of people who think danger is just another word for interesting experience. And of course, there were a few who joined simply because they had no better option. Which, historically speaking, is a very common reason people end up in dramatic situations. Before departure, the captain spent weeks preparing. Every crate checked, every instrument tested, every supply list reviewed and re-reviewed. People joked that he trusted numbers more than people, which was not entirely wrong. He believed in preparation, because preparation was something you could control. The sea was not. At the harbor, the ships slowly came together. Wooden giants resting against the docks, creaking slightly even when still. They looked strong, but also fragile in a way that only makes sense when you've seen enough storms. Families gathered nearby. Children, friends, sometimes just curious crowds who liked the idea of witnessing something historic. There were letters being written last minute. Some people laughed too loudly, others stayed quiet for too long. The captain walked through it all with calm steps. He spoke when needed, nodded when appropriate, but mostly observed, because leaders don't always get the luxury of feeling everything in the moment. They have to keep things moving, even when part of them already knows what moving forward really means. On the final night before departure, the harbor was unusually quiet. Even the wind felt like it was waiting. The captain stood alone near the ship, looking at the water, thinking, maybe about the route, maybe about the crew, or maybe about how once you leave, there's no real guarantee of returning the same person. A younger officer approached him and asked something simple. "Do you think we're ready?" The captain didn't answer immediately, which is usually not comforting. After a pause, he said, "We are as ready as anyone has ever been," which is another way of saying, "Not really, but let's not panic yet." The officer nodded anyway, probably choosing optimism over realism, a wise survival strategy in fairness. And then came the morning of departure. The harbor was alive again. Ropes loosened, sails prepared, final supplies loaded, and slowly the ships moved. Not quickly, not dramatically, just steadily, like something that knows it cannot turn back anymore. People on the shore waved. Some smiled, some cried, some just stood there silently, like they were trying to memorize the moment without fully understanding why. The captain stood at the deck, watching the land shrink. He didn't wave much. He had already said his goodbyes in his own way. And as the coastline faded, the world behind them began to feel less like home, and more like a memory that was already starting to drift away. Ahead of them lay open water, unknown distances, and a horizon that had no interest in explaining what came next. At that moment, everything still felt possible, which, as history often shows us, is both the most beautiful and most misleading feeling in the world. And so the expedition began. Not with disaster, not with panic, but with quiet certainty, and the belief that whatever lay ahead could be reached.